Thankful to have been invited to speak this morning, and it's great to be here 2 weeks in a row. Was just saying to Myron, I already feel a little bit like, yes, I feel a little at home after 2 weeks. So thanks for your welcome. No, we have been missionaries in Europe a long time in different countries. And of course, we've given things up to be missionaries. There's no question. We've missed a lot of events in our larger family with our nieces, our nephew. Those are hard things sometimes to miss. But on the other hand, there are certain perks to being a missionary in Europe, I must say. One of them is just the beautiful cities and the great places that we can see. And of course, many people go as tourists to Europe. We're privileged to live there and to just enjoy certain things all the time. And one of the things is that we've had a chance to travel in Europe a little bit, usually going to conferences or ministry assignments, but we've seen a lot of beautiful scenery. And I thought of that as I was thinking of this sermon today. The topic I was given was, well, the topic I chose really from the list was the mountains of the Bible and how they point to Christ. And so one of the things we've seen are many beautiful mountains. Of course, there are beautiful mountains here in the US. There are the beautiful Alps and other mountains in Europe that we've gotten a chance to see. And not only have we served in Europe, we also have some family members in Europe. My sister was an exchange student in Switzerland, and she married a Swiss man. They have one son, and they live in the beautiful city of Lugano in the southern part of Switzerland. And my nephew just recently graduated from college with a degree in something sort of like mechanical engineering, I think. And he works on the cable cars that go up and down some of the mountain resorts. Now, this is really in strong contrast to where we've been living the last 21 years, which is the Netherlands. And the Netherlands, you probably know, is a very flat country. In fact, the word the Netherlands means the Low Countries. And the Netherlands, in some places, is so low that it's below sea level. In fact, our house where we live was 9 feet below sea level. It was in a community that used to be underwater, and they pumped the water out in the 70s and built a housing development. And very, very secure, very safe, no danger of flooding, because the Dutch people are very, very good at keeping the water back. In fact, there's a famous saying, I couldn't figure out who said it from Googling. It's an anonymous saying, but the saying is, God created the earth, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. Because of all of this pumping the water and making the dikes. So that was a low country, as opposed to the high mountainous countries of my sister and my nephew's homeland. So the thing about low countries versus high countries, low countries can easily be invaded. Of course, we're going to Romania because we could go to Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine is very much on our hearts at this point. But many other countries have been invaded through history because they didn't have that natural protection. Some countries, I think of Montenegro in former Yugoslavia, high mountains were a defensive place where people could go. They could go up and they could look down on their enemies and they could defend their position. And so mountains can sometimes be a place of defense, a place of security. Mountains can symbolize security. They can symbolize strength, power. We think of beauty. We think of their majesty, their awe. And we can also think of mountains as obstacles to overcome in our lives, if we think of them as a metaphor. So when I think of mountains in Scripture, I saw that mountains are often the place where things happen throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I'm going to look briefly at several mountains in the Old and New Testament. Just an overview, just a bird's eye view, as though we were flying with those birds over the mountain peaks, just to fly over them and to see an overview, to see what they show us about God. But first, I want to talk about Mount Ararat. Mount Ararat is the scene of the landing of the ark. And you know these stories, so I'm just going to briefly read a few verses, briefly make a couple comments, and then you'll see the overview. So let's read from Genesis 8, 1 through 12, just quickly. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven were closed. The rain from the heavens were restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. Maybe I'll summarize then. You know that Noah opened the window of the ark and sent a raven forth. And then he sent forth a dove. He sent a dove out of the ark, and it flew around, couldn't find a place to land, returned to the ark. But later, Noah sent the dove out again, and the dove flew away and evidently found a fresh greenery, because the dove brought back a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. And then later the dove went out again and didn't come back, because the dove had found a place to live that was dry. So what can we say here when we look at this mountain, Mount Ararat? We can summarize that humankind had been sinful. God had judged the world with the flood, but saved a remnant in the ark. When we think of a remnant, of course, we can also think of we, the believers, the church, as a remnant that has been saved, that is being saved. God saves a remnant oftentimes. God saved a remnant of humanity in the ark, and the ark came to rest on Ararat. So God brought the ark, he brought the animals, he brought the people who were being saved to solid ground and stopped his judgment. So I would say from this story that we can see that God is merciful. He judged, but he was merciful. He brought the people and the animals to solid ground and showed his mercy. So flying over to the next mountain peak, in Genesis 22, we read about Mount Moriah. Again, I know you know the story of Abraham and the order to sacrifice his son Isaac. So I'm just going to summarize from Genesis 22, 10 through 18. You know the story of how Abraham didn't understand what God was asking him to do, that he brought Isaac with him, that he brought him up the mountain, up Mount Moriah. And when he got ready to do the deed, the angel of the Lord called him and said, Abraham, Abraham, don't lay your hand on the boy or do anything for him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And then Abraham looked up and he saw in the thicket that there was a ram there for the sacrifice instead. And so Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. On the mount of the Lord, it shall be provided, it says. So of course, Abraham was ordered to sacrifice Isaac. And I know that this passage is one that many people find difficult. Now, each one of these passages, many sermons could be preached on them. We're doing the overview. So I just want to say two things about this story. In other religions of that time, apparently child sacrifice was not uncommon. So it would, although horrible, it wouldn't have looked as horrible to Abraham, I think, as it looks to us today. That's no justification. That's just, I think, the fact that it wouldn't have seemed out of the blue. But the thing is, number two, God never meant to let Abraham complete this sacrifice. I don't believe he ever did. In fact, he stopped him in time. He didn't mean for it to go that far. It was, I think, an elaborate kind of test to see if Abraham would obey him. That's it. Yeah, it was a confusing command to him to see if Abraham would obey to sacrifice not only his son, of course, but this child was the son of promise, the son of the covenant. And so, of course, this whole action is a powerful image of Jesus, who was to come, who would be the Lamb of God, who would be sacrificed, who would pay the price for our sins. So I think that we can say about God from this story, God has a plan. That sounds a little bit wishy-washy to me. So I scratched that out and I wrote, God is working his purpose out. He has a purpose. He's working his purpose out, even in the most confusing times. And that's the lesson I take from this mountain for today. God, even in the most confusing times, even in the things that seem most confusing to us, God is working his purpose out. Now, the next mountain, just quickly going over to Exodus, Mount Sinai, one of the most famous mountains. For good reason, this is where the giving of the law happened. You know that the people of Israel had gone out from the land of Egypt. They came into the wilderness of Sinai and they camped around the mountain. Now I'm summarizing from Exodus 19, 1 through 8. Moses went up the mountain to God. And the Lord called to him out of the mountain and says, you saw what I did to the Egyptians and how I brought you here to myself. So if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you'll be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. So Moses gives them that message, and they agree that they will follow the Lord. They agree. But we know that actually what happened after that, when Moses was up on Mount Sinai, when God was giving him the tablets of the law, what was Israel doing down below, the nation of Israel? Well, they had fallen into the temptation to worship an idol. In fact, to worship the golden calf that they had created out of the gold that they had received from the Egyptians. They had taken off all of their jewelry and melted it down and made an idol, maybe similar to the idols they had seen in Egypt. And they began worshiping this idol. And so, of course, God was angry at what they had done. On the other hand, God went ahead and gave them the law through Moses so that they could see what holy behavior was meant to be, so that holy behavior, the law, the covenant of the law, was codified for them for generations to come, for hundreds of years. So what can we see from Mount Sinai? We could learn all kinds of lessons, of course, preach all kinds of sermons, but I just want to say that I think we can see that God is holy. God is holy. We see that this mountain teaches us that God is holy. Now, briefly, I want to mention another mountain that has to do with Moses, Mount Nebo, Deuteronomy 34, 1 through 6. I'm not going to turn there myself. Mount Nebo is where Moses, at the end of his life, was brought by God to see the promised land, but he could not enter because of previous sin that he had done. I'm really summarizing because I think all of you know these stories very well. Moses couldn't enter the promised land because he had sinned. He had struck a rock rather than speaking to it. And it didn't seem like such a big deal when we would read the story, but to God, that was disobedience. And so God let Moses look into the promised land, but he was not allowed to enter. So that was Mount Nebo. And what could we maybe conclude from this story? I conclude that God is just from this story. God will have a consequence for sin in people's lives. And so it was with Moses as well. Now, Mount Zion, or Jerusalem, is really not one mountain, but a collection of 7 hills. Jerusalem is built on 7 hills. And it is sometimes called Mount Zion for short. Different places. So when we hear Mount Zion, of course, we have all kinds of pictures. I'm going to go back to Mount Zion, Jerusalem, in the Psalms, Psalm 121. Now, people went up to Jerusalem. They went up because Jerusalem was built on these hills, is built on these hills. And Psalms 120 through 134, maybe you know, are called the Psalms of Ascents, to ascend. When people ascended those mountains, when they went to Jerusalem for big feasts and festivals. They went up, and as they went, evidently they sang those songs, those psalms. And of course, those are some of the, I think, some of the most beautiful and most moving psalms, 120 through 134. So I want to read 121, one of those psalms that, of course, has to do with hills, with mountains. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time forth and forevermore. Such a beautiful psalm, and I know it's very meaningful to many of us. So David lifts up his eyes to the hills. So used to hearing that in a spiritualized way, to giving spiritual meaning to that. What did David mean by that? I think that David, in times of war, was looking to get to higher ground. He was looking to get to a defensible position. He was looking to the hills. He was maybe looking also for reinforcements to come in his battles, in the war that he was involved in the battles he was doing. He was looking to get to higher ground. He was looking for reinforcements, and he looks up to the hills, but he realizes that any help is actually not as important as the help that comes from the Lord. In this sense, David, the man of war, realizes that actually it's from the Lord that help is coming. The strength is coming from the Lord. I think it's interesting, and I read this in C.S. Lewis's commentary on the Psalms the first time, and it made sense to me that the Psalms were often written talking about physical danger. Oftentimes, David and others were in physical danger. So many of the things that the Psalms talk about are about the danger and the joy and the pain that they are going through right there in their physical realm. But we, looking back, spiritualize those Psalms, rightly so, I think, and we see that they are also talking about our spiritual battle, our spiritual joy, our spiritual struggles. And the same is true with the Psalm. We lift up our eyes to the hills. Well, we may or may not have an actual mountain up there to look out at, but we can think of those obstacles in our lives. We can think of those battles, those struggles, even those high points in our lives, and say, where does my help come from? Actually, Lord, my help comes from you. So our help comes not from an advantageous mountain lookout or a place of security physically, but it comes from God. And so what does this teach us from God, about God, this psalm? I think that we can clearly say that one thing it teaches is that God is strong, God is powerful, God is the source of strength for us. Now, one more in the Old Testament that I wanted to include is Mount Carmel. In 1 Kings 18, 20 through 40, I'm not going to read all that, but this is the story of the prophet Elijah. And this is a story of the struggle between Elijah, representing the true God, and the prophets of Baal, 450 or so prophets of Baal. Now, who was Baal? This is a question that scholars sometimes may disagree about or have discussions about. Baal may be one god. It's more likely that Baal is a term that's used for a lot of false gods, different false gods. Perhaps those false gods that required sometimes child sacrifice, those false gods maybe that had temple prostitution, those false gods that did a lot of things and required a lot of things that were not holy, not according to God's law. These were false gods. Baal was a false god or a group of false gods throughout the Old Testament. He may have been the god of the storm, like the thunder god. He may have been the god of fertility. His name may have been Hadad. That's a name that I've read that's sometimes associated with Baal. His symbol is sometimes the bull, very strong, very masculine kind of symbol. So Baal is definitely a false god. There's no question here in 1 Kings. And God sent fire from heaven in response to Elijah's prayer. I'm not going to read it. I'm just going to summarize that this was a big contest. Maybe you remember that the 450 prophets of Baal were pleading for Baal to send fire down from heaven. They were screaming, they were crying out, they were even cutting themselves to show how earnestly they were praying. And of course, nothing was heard from this false god. But Elijah prayed, and God sent fire from heaven. There's more to the story, but the main point is God sent fire from heaven immediately in response to Elijah's prayer. Baal did not respond, but God, the true God, responded to the prophet Elijah's prayer to show himself powerfully in front of all of these false prophets. So I think we can clearly see that God is the one true God from this mountain, Mount Carmel. God is the one true God. Now, when we pass to the New Testament, just have a couple of things to say. I didn't want to leave out the Sermon on the Mount, even though we don't really know which mountain, as far as I could tell, if the Sermon on the Mount happened on or near. It probably was one of the hills of Galilee, perhaps on the lake, on the shore of Lake Galilee. And on this mountain, Jesus sat, he taught, he expounded his teaching, he expanded on the law that had been given on Mount Sinai, but he corrected the Pharisees' interpretation of it. He really focused on the main points. He focused on the real meaning behind the law, not just the physical observance of it. He showed that God looks at the heart, not just at the deeds that we do. So it isn't just about killing someone, thou shalt not kill, but do you hate your brother in your heart? It isn't just about committing adultery, but do you lust for something else or someone else in your heart? God is looking at the heart, and this is an amazing interpretation and a way to see the true nature of what God requires, and to see that none of us can measure up, that we need God, we need Christ and his sacrifice to be made holy. But I see from the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus is God. Who else teaches like he does? Who else would dare to speak for the Lord, the Father, than the Son? So Jesus is God. We could spend a whole year preaching on the Sermon on the Mount, but that's just one thing that we can see. Jesus is God. Now, Jesus reveals his glory on the Mount of Transfiguration. And to mention the passage, again, just going to summarize, in Luke 9, 28 to 36, the story is one place where the Transfiguration is described. The Transfiguration was an amazing event. It's a little hard to understand why or how, except that Jesus was displaying his glory before Peter, James, and John, a small inner group of his disciples, and Jesus was transfigured. It was a vision. It was an amazing sight of light and glory that instead of just seeing the man Jesus there in front of them, they saw all of his glory, the brightness, the magnificence of who Jesus is, who he truly is. He revealed a vision of his glory. And not just Peter, James, and John were there, but also Moses and Elijah appeared with him. It's an interesting fact that in this sense, Moses in some way was actually present there in the promised land, in this vision of transfiguration. Jesus is glorious. God is glorious. That's a truth that comes back in many of our songs of worship. In fact, this morning we've already sung what a beautiful name it is. What a wonderful name Jesus has. Jesus is glorious. There are many hymns of praise that mention this. And It's wonderful to think of. Now, we're almost at the end. I have two more short sections. I want to talk about Mount Zion again, but not just the physical Jerusalem. I want to say a few words from Hebrews 12 about the heavenly Jerusalem. So Hebrews 12, of course, Hebrews is a book, I think, that's sometimes very mysterious. There are a lot of things said about there are lots of things said in Hebrews about angels, about heaven, about what Jesus means, who he really is, that I think are very deep and very profound. And one of the things is that Mount Zion is really not just the physical Jerusalem, not even the physical Jerusalem, but that there is a heavenly Jerusalem. So let me just read those verses. Hebrews 12, 18 through 24. For you have not come to what may be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest and the sound of a trumpet and a voice whose words made the hearers vague, that no further messages be spoken to them. What are they talking about? He's talking about, I should say he or she, the writer of Hebrews, is talking about Mount Sinai, the giving of the law. That's the blazing fire and darkness and gloom and the tempest and the voice whose words made the hearers vague, that no further messages be spoken to them. The law, Mount Sinai. No, they could not endure the order that was given. If even a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Indeed, so terrifying was the sight that Moses said, I tremble with fear. So there is a lot of fear in the law. In keeping the law, there's fear, because how can anyone measure up? But the writer goes on and says, no, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festal gathering, in other words, in their party clothes, and to the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Oh, there's so much in that passage that we could unpack, but I just want to say that we don't have to fear the law. We are not there at Mount Sinai. We are with Jesus, the angels, and the firstborn rejoicing. We're being sanctified by Jesus' death. The sprinkled blood, his sprinkled blood, not the Passover lamb anymore, but Jesus' blood has conquered the murderous death started in the world when Cain killed Abel. So it's just an amazing passage, an amazing truth, that it's not the Old Testament covenant of the law, but it's the New Testament covenant of grace. Now, I don't want to push that too far. I'm not saying we shouldn't obey the law. No, the law is still there, but Jesus fulfills the law and he interprets it for us. So it's the New Testament covenant of grace through Christ's sacrifice of himself, where we are and where we live as the church. Not law, but grace. God is grace. That's what we can see from Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. In conclusion, well, not quite conclusion, but this is the last passage really. And this is John 4, 19 through 26, Jesus with the Samaritan woman. And this is really where it comes to, I think. Do these mountains matter? How do they matter to us? They show salvation history. They show how God has dealt with humankind from the earliest days of Genesis until today. I don't know if you've ever made a pilgrimage to a place that was very meaningful to you. I feel that way when I go to my home church, which I hardly ever go, the place where Phil and I met, where we were married. Sometimes if I'm even driving in that neighborhood back in Pittsburgh, I feel like, wow, this was a place where many important things happened in my life. And so in a sense, it's a little bit of a pilgrimage. But the thing is, I know that there's nothing in that place. It's God. It's what God did in that place. And I think that it's the same for any place. So the Samaritan woman asks us a question similar to that. She says, on what mountain should we worship? Let me read this. John 4, 19 through 26. She's really asking the question about mountains. She says, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." The Jews say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and it is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." So on what mountain should we worship? In which church building should we worship? In which place should we worship? In which nation? In which country? The answer that Jesus gives: none, any, anywhere, everywhere. It doesn't matter, because Jesus says worship in spirit and in truth. The time is coming, and it's here, that we should worship in spirit and truth. Worship with the Spirit, worship with our spirit, worship in the truth of doctrine, worship the true God, I would say that means. So Jesus is the person who is the center of worship. David, when we think back to the Psalms, he sought physical safety, but actually Jesus is the rock. I think you had a sermon about Jesus being the rock recently. At least it was on the list. Jesus is the rock. He's the rock that is higher. He's the solid rock. He's not sinking sand. So in conclusion, we should focus on him above all else. Now, we read in Psalm 121 that we lift our eyes to the hills. Where does our help come? We've reflected on these mountains very, very briefly, and we reflected on God, his character, some of his covenants with humankind. But true worship of him, Jesus says, doesn't depend on holy places, but worshiping in spirit and truth. And I pray that that's what I will do. I pray that that's what you will be doing, that we can be encouraged by these words, by this message. We've seen that God is merciful. We've seen that he is working his purpose out. We've seen that he's holy, that he is just. We've seen that he's strong and true. We've seen that the Father is Jesus, that God is Jesus. Jesus and the Father are together, that the triune God is working his purpose out. We see that they are glorious, that he, Jesus, is glorious, that God is glorious. We see that God gives us grace, and we see that gives us salvation. So we can be encouraged. God is with us. He will meet us, and he will meet us during the mountaintop experiences of our lives. And even as well, he will experience with us our deepest valleys and meet us there. So if you're on a mountaintop experience, if you're looking for help from the Lord, if you're going through a deep valley, let's focus on Jesus and trust in him. Let's pray.